I'm Peter Fonagy. I'm Chief Executive of the Anna Freud Center. And first, a very warm welcome to our Transformation Seminar with Sophie Scott. I'm really delighted to have Sophie as a colleague at UCL, and I feel incredibly privileged to have her as a speaker today at our Transformation Seminar this evening. The theme of the seminar is thinking differently about mental health. The seminars, we hope, provide a public space to explore and reflect on how we might think about the growing problem of child and family mental health. The seminars invite speakers to respond to a very simple question, which is, what is their idea to transform children and families' mental health in the UK? They explore areas beyond clinical interventions, important though those are, to ask how we can think about, understand, and do things differently, individually, collectively, and as a society. Now, before I go any further, there's a little bit of housekeeping that I should cover. We would like to invite you to ask questions, which Sophie will answer at the end of her seminar. At the bottom of the screen, there is a space for Q&As, and if you'd like to submit your questions, we'll try to get through as many of them as possible at the time that's available. Finally, if you are tweeting, please tag the Anna Freud Center and use the hashtag Transformation Seminars. So let me introduce Sophie. I'm really pleased to welcome Sophie Scott. Her subject today is From Language to Laughter and Back Again. It's a fascinating subject and one that is particularly relevant as we gradually, fingers crossed, emerge from lockdown, having had a year of reduced social interactions with one another. One of Sophie's interesting facts is that you are 30 times more likely to laugh if you are with someone than if you're on your own. So I kind of wonder what has happened to laughter over the last year or so. What's the impact on our relationship of social isolation? One of the many brilliant things about listening to Sophie is the way that she combines her insights into neuroscience of speech and speech perception with her natural gift of communicating. Sophie is one of the most entertaining lecturers I know. So, Sophie, no pressure. You only have to look at her Twitter page, which I wholeheartedly recommend that you do, and you'll find discussions about whether a cuttlefish is more intelligent than an octopus, but the decor in 1970s wimpy takeaways and Morecambe and Wise, just to name a few. Sophie's curiosity is extraordinary, and she brings with her a sense of joy about her learning. As well as a gifted communicator, she's also a seriously important academic, researching the evolution of speech, the difference between intelligibility and comprehension, and profiles of recovery in aphasia. She has great interest in dyslexia and the process of emotional information in the voice and how our brains control the production of our voice. Sophie is a professor of cognitive neuroscience at UCL and is a welcome senior research fellow in basic medical science. She is director of the Institute of Cognitive Science at UCL and is a prolific writer, having contributed several hundred publications, of which 72 were cited by other scholarly papers by more than 72 times. Take my word for it, that's seriously awesome. She was elected to the Academy of Medical Sciences in 2012 and to the British Academy in 2016. More relevant here, Sophie has been nominated twice for a UCL Students' Choice Award for inspirational teaching. Sophie has exceptional skills in science communication with non-expert and lay audiences, skills which she has worked on developing over her career. She has been a regular speaker on TED Talks, talked at Davos, and gave the Royal Institution Christmas lectures in 2017. She was awarded the CBE in 2020 in recognition to her contributions to neuroscience. But actually, all these shrink into insignificance, in my eyes, at any rate, in contrast to what a superb colleague Sophie is. She's the epitome of conscientious, caring leader, collegial to her fingertips. It's a massive privilege to have her as a colleague at UCL. So I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to this seminar. Without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Sophie to talk from language to laughter and back again. Sophie.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for that absolutely lovely introduction. I guarantee you there's no way my talk can live up to this. I'm just going to find my talk and start sharing my screen. Great, thank you. Again, so thank you very much to Peter for his very kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to get to work with him at UCL. I've been really, it's been a very, very strange past 18 months, but it has been, you find out a lot about how people can work together in very different circumstances, and it's been an interesting journey. So I want to take I'm going to talk about language and laughter, and I want to start with something slightly more basic, which is to think about information that humans communicate with, and that's how I'm going to get into voices. And a lot of the sort of the framework that people use when they talk about this actually starts with faces. We are better at dealing with a variety of information from the face than actually we are with voices. So actually, I'm glad that Peter mentioned Morecambe and Wise. Here are Morecambe and Wise demonstrating for me three of the key kinds of information that we get from faces, and which have all been studied very intently in terms of facial processing. So when you are looking at somebody, either a photograph of them or in the real world, there are different kinds of information. You get information about identity. If you know that person, it's likely you can recognize them from their face. You get information about their emotional state, or the emotional state they are choosing to communicate with you. Again, that's very clearly signposted on our faces. Only Wise here looks happy. And also, if you are speaking, then you are not only making a sound, you move your face when you talk, and a great deal of information about what you're saying is present in the face. So for example, everybody finds it easier to understand a speaker if they can see them as well as hear them. So it's a very, very basic effect. And very generally, in terms of the way that this has been modeled, and I'm showing you without apology an extremely elderly slide here. This is from the classic days of cognitive modeling. Here is the Bruce and Young model of facial information processing, which is basically arguing that these three different kinds of information, identity, emotion, and language from the face, are actually processed along different cognitive and neural bases. So for example, they can be separately damaged. You can have problems recognizing faces, but still be able to recognize what the emotion is being expressed on that face, and still use lip reading information from that face. So there is very clear kind of separation to some extent of this different kind of information. And the other thing that I think is important about this is that face people have always dealt with these three things. They say that speech is as important as identity, as important as emotion. They don't go off into one particular silo, which isn't really what happens when we get to voices. So if we think about voices and how we can apply this kind of approach to this, we do need to think a little bit about what it is we're talking about when we're thinking about voices. Now, human voices actually share a great deal in common with all mammal vocalizations. It's a very highly conserved way of making sounds. And basically, when mammals vocalize, what they do is they use the larynx, which is the Adam's apple if you're male, which is a structure that has actually evolved to stop things from falling down into the lungs, all mammals, certainly all land mammals, have learned to pull the larynx together closed, even when they're not choking, and then push air through that to make a sound, which they then shape with their mouths. And that's called the source filter theory. So the source is a sound, a buzzing sound made at the larynx. And then the filter is everything you do with your face and your throat to kind of project that. So here we've got an example of source filter theory in action, looking at a deer. So here we've got the larynx in a red deer, and you're going to see a red deer vocalizing. You're probably thinking, interesting though it is to see a red deer, Sophie, I don't absolutely see what this has got to do with your talk, but actually it is quite useful to think about human voices in the context of how other mammals vocalize, because I don't think we give humans enough credit for the sheer complexity of what we do with this very basic mechanism of source and filter. We produce something very different, and that's because of several quite precise changes that have happened in evolution. So we have, for example, a lowered larynx, permanently lowered larynx, meaning we are actually the only animal that can choke. We've stopped our larynx from doing its job. And that lower larynx gives us a longer pipe to make the sounds of speech. And it also gives us a sort of uncouples the back of the tongue from the larynx, meaning there's a lot more flexibility for the tongue compared to all other mammals where the tongue is very much anchored at the back of the tongue to the larynx. So it can't move in the same way. And that really matters when it comes to human speech. So if we run our MRI scanner effectively as a video camera, what we can see is that inside the human articulators, when we're talking, our source and our filter are so much more complex. We've got a sound being made down here at the voice box, and then that is being continuously shaped by the articulators. So the tongue is moving with incredible dexterity. You've got the lips, the jaw, the soft palate. And what this effectively means is that we have a source and a filter, and they change continuously. There is literally no other land mammal that can approach the complexity of what we're able to do with our voices. They're absolutely extraordinary instruments for sound. Now, what we've done historically in psychology and neuroscience is look at that sound and said, well, that's language. And that's actually, unlike what we do with faces, that tends to be what we've gone with this. So we've taken this amazing noise and totally understandably explored this in the context of looking at the linguistic elements. And I absolutely did this myself for many years as well. That's even though I knew the words are not the only things we say. So here's an example of somebody talking on the radio, and she's about to read the news on the Today program. So she's about to read the news headlines, and you're going to hear something that she hears that has an effect on her. So just listen to what starts to happen to her voice.
Singarock's unpopular replacement has now been dismissed, with the Army's popular Chief of Staff, Jack Twat, taking over.
A 40-foot sperm whale, which was stranded in the Firth of Forth for more than 4 days, is now thought to be swimming towards open waters again. It freed itself late last night. Marine experts are hoping to establish this morning whether the whale is finally back at sea.
Good luck to the whale. 8:10 is the time. An investigation is underway.
So just like that photograph of Morecambe and Wise I showed you at the top, there was clearly all that same kind of information was shown here. We have different hawkers. There are different vocal identities there. There was speech. You could understand the story about the Firth of Forth and the popular Chief of Staff. And also, if you listen carefully, you start to hear that Charlotte Green starts laughing halfway through the whale in the Firth of Forth because somebody has whispered to her about the humorous name Jack Twat that was mentioned earlier. And although she is talking on the radio and she doesn't want to start laughing, she does. And we'll come back to exactly why that might have happened later on. But the first thing that it does is it changes her voice. You can't miss the fact that there's some emotion breaking through there. If you're not a native speaker of English, you may have thought she was starting to cry, but the fact that there was some kind of emotion was pretty unmissable there. So those three things, vocal identity, speech and language and emotion, are all equally present in the voice as they are in the face. Now, I'm very old, and I got involved in doing functional imaging back in the 1990s when people were really first had their hands on this technology. And let's pretend I was very young at the time. But the interesting thing is that we actually, right from the outset, people were very keen on using functional imaging techniques to ask about the neural basis of language, because we had a very good idea about where we should start looking based on the long history of studying patients who had deficits in language perception or production following brain damage, so the work of Paul Broca or Carl Wernicke. So we went into the 1990s with a pretty good idea of what these new techniques like fMRI could actually tell us about what was happening in the brain. We would expect to see something left lateralized, because language is on the whole left lateralized in the vast majority of people. Something to do with production in the frontal lobe, something to do with perception in the temporal lobes, with an emphasis at the back end of the left temporal lobe. Now, just for context, that is not something that has remained unchanged under the next sort of 30 years. And there's now a lot more interest, and this is the kind of perspective that I have been looking at these systems with that kind of eye, is to understand more than just, well, like a neuropsychological model of this is perception, that's production. We now know that, as in the visual system, there are streams of processing for auditory information in primate brains, and actually a lot of what we're seeing in functional imaging is reflecting that sort of general principle of how primate brains are organized relative to like these blobs that are associated with exactly where there were deficits had by patients. The other thing that was quite striking, so this is an example of quite an early functional imaging study, just comparing people listening to speech to listening to nothing. Remember, we're expecting to see left lateralized responses with a peak at the back end of the left temporal lobe, and these are called glass brain images. So what you've got is just all the activation that there is in the brain is shown here, and that's from the left, from the back, from the top, and you've got absolutely symmetrical activation running forward down the temporal lobes. You could not put a fig leaf between the left and the right sides of the brain here. And it didn't make any sense at first. Why would it be so very different to what we were seeing with the patients? What was going on here? And it took me a very long time to realize, of course, this is a study where people are listening to speech versus listening to nothing. You know, you're always looking at relative patterns of activation in functional imaging studies. And that was, of course, there's no real control here for the fact that when you hear speech, you're hearing a incredibly complex sound. So you don't know how much of this activation is to do with the noise that people are making, or if it's to do with the, you know, the linguistic elements of this. And of course, with, you know, the longer I worked on this, the more I realized, and it's not just a noise that you're hearing when somebody's talking, you hear a talker. There's never speech without someone speaking. And so all that information, the emotional content of the speech, this talker identity are there, as well as the words that they're saying. And of course, the brain doesn't care about your experiment. The brain doesn't care that you think you're looking at language. And the brain is saying, well, I'm interested in all of this. And the short story, long story short, that's a lot of what we're seeing here. But this is something I was interested in trying to actually unpack what was going on. And with my colleague Stuart Rosen over in the what's now the Speech, Hearing and Phonetic Sciences department at UCL, we devised a study where effectively, and I won't go into the details here because it's quite boring, what we wanted to know is, if we really finely control for the acoustic content of speech, can we identify brain areas that respond to speech regardless of what it sounds like? So we were comparing things like this, clear speech,
they're buying some
and things
bread.
like this, which sound like a very harsh whisper, where we've taken out some information you couldn't recognize the talker here at all, over very well matched acoustic controls. So that whispery speech, they're buying some bread, it doesn't even have a really strong sense of pitch. You don't have the melody of speech there at all. Where you did this, and what you find is now wonderful, hurrah, we could find an area now in the left temporal lobe, which we're expecting to find, which is sitting forward down the temporal lobe, not at the back end where we were expecting it, where you generally see a response that is responding to intelligibility in speech, but it is not interested in what that talker sounds like. It seems to be much less interested in the talker characteristics. And over the next sort of 20 years, what I've done is I've really unpacked this in detail. So what you can find is this, basically this system running forward down the temporal lobe, exactly mirroring this pathway that we find in primate auditory anatomy that seems to be associated with processing important auditory information for primates. This is definitely important for decoding speech. It responds to not just intelligibility, but you can find responses here to the phonetic information in speech, to the syntactic information in speech, to the semantic information in speech, to multiple sources of speech. That's all being pulled out here. You're glimpsing here, in fact, an incredibly complex system for getting linguistic information out of the voice. But it's not the only thing that was going on. Remember, the brain doesn't care about your experiment. So what we found in this study also was there was lots of activation still happening in the right temporal lobe, which is consistent with the previous studies. It just wasn't very interested in the intelligibility of the speech. Here, it seems to be responding to the fact that in that clear speech, they're buying some bread. You have a clear, there's intelligibility, but there's also pitch variation. And in fact, even if you remove the intelligibility, but you kept the pitch, keep the pitch variation, keep the melody of the voice, you're activating these right fields. So you've definitely got already a dissociation. The left seems to care about, in a very general abstract sense, linguistic information in the talker's voice. And the right side of the brain seems to care about the pitch variation. And in fact, that has been very widely reported in studies of music. There is a stronger sensitivity for not pitch itself, which seems to be computed bilaterally in the human brain or the primate brain, but what you're seeing is a sensitivity to the directionality of pitch, very important for music, very important for speech, and that seems to be genuinely a preference in the right temporal lobe. This again is a study that Stuart Rosen and I did with Carolyn McGettigan, and what we did here was we removed the pitch information. I'm afraid I don't have an example, but it sounds a bit like this. Instead of they're buying some bread, it sounds like they're buying some bread. And I was worried with this because it sounds so artificial that I thought this is just going to be peculiar, but it doesn't matter. Artificial though that sounds, the right temporal lobe selectively prefers the naturalistic pitch information, the natural melody of voices over this flattened speech, very significantly not showing this effect on the left side of the brain. And we also find a strong sensitivity to emotional vocalizations, things like screams and laughs and disgusted sounds, again, in the right temporal lobe. And so that strongly suggests that, as in the face, we really do have lots of different information being pulled out from the voice. And there is some suggestion that this is happening across different hemispheres, at least something to do with talker identity, certainly from other people's studies, has been associated with this rightwards pathway, the melody in the voice, the emotion in the voice, whereas the left side of the brain seems to really care about the meaning of what's being said. But even that is not immune to the sort of social meaning in a voice. So this is a study that I did in collaboration with my late colleague, Andy Calder, who worked in Cambridge and was very interested in eye gaze. And he was finding actually these very similar right temporal lobe regions really care about the position of eye gaze. And we care a lot about eye gaze, humans. We care where people are looking. We use that a great deal. So I thought, what would happen if you put that together with speech? So we designed a study where people are listening to a talker and they are watching a talker, and that talker is either looking down, looking at them, looking away, or her eyes are covered. And we designed the stimuli, the acoustic stimuli, such that they were very hard to understand unless you were watching the talker. So you had to keep watching her to be able to understand what was being said. And in fact, what she says, where she looks rather, doesn't influence the intelligibility of what's being said. You're getting the lip reading information really is coming from the lower half of the face. However, if we look at the results, what we find is that that left hemisphere, left temporal lobe response that was greater to intelligible speech was increased in activation when the talker was looking at you versus when she was looking away or down, her eyes were covered. As it doesn't actually increase the intelligibility of the speech, we suspect this is salience. It means something different if somebody is looking at you when they speak. So even the abstract response to speech is being strongly influenced by these social factors. So we've got this kind of way into the system. Obviously, that's not all human language. It's always a bit of a con for me to use language in my talks and then divert people rapidly off into, actually, I meant speech. Because obviously language is a much wider network than just intelligibility. And if you do something like increase the power of your contrast, so this is showing that same contrast of intelligible speech over an unintelligible baseline, but now over more participants, and in fact over two different language groups, you start to see not just this left anterior response, but now areas at the front end of the temporal lobe and the bottom of the temporal lobe, which are strongly associated with truly amodal semantic representations. If you do something like manipulate the speech such that the acoustics don't change, but actually what makes a difference is how predictable the sentence is. So all people will find speech that is predictable easier to understand than unpredictable speech. So a sentence like "the ship sailed across the bay" is much more easy to understand than a sentence like "Sue discussed the dive." And when we do this, when we hold the acoustics constant, but we vary intelligibility by this contextual factor, what you find is actually the activation now all jumps out of the temporal lobe, and we're seeing a left lateralized semantic network involving the inferior frontal gyrus, posterior parietal lobe, medial frontal cortex, and the precuneus. So again, at any one of these studies, you're only ever glimpsing a little bit of what's going on. And as soon as you let the rest of the brain tell you what it's doing with the spoken language, you see all these areas that are using context to help support comprehension. Interestingly, again, not linked just to speech comprehension. So this is in fact an active decision-making task where people had to think about the meanings of words versus think about how many syllables were in the words. And these were written words, and you get a very, very similar network recruited. So this is it's a much wider amodal semantic network. And of course, that also feeds into speech production. So when you are talking, this same semantic network that we've seen for context and for thinking about the meanings of words is recruited as part of the planning of speech. The actual motor implementation of speech actually follows something somewhat different. So I flagged up at the start of the talk that humans have got the same basic anatomy as other land mammals that they use for producing their voices. We do have a very different pattern of neural control. Indeed, much like with our manual dexterity, there is a good argument. They said it's not just these physical adaptations of our articulators that mean that we're good at speaking. It's our neural control that makes it possible for us to do these much more extraordinary things with our voices. And indeed, humans have these what are called the lateral motor areas, which sit in the precentral sulcus, which are recruited during speech production, which you don't find recruited during vocalizations in other mammals, and seem to be one of the systems that are important for this pattern of vocal dexterity. There's only one part of a bigger network. So you have motor cortex, sensory cortex, auditory cortex, supplementary motor area. These are all recruited when you're speaking. You also get lots of activation in in basal ganglia areas in the thalamus. I haven't shown it here, but I do. You've also got lots going on in the cerebellum. You also, within this, which is all very bilateral, you have a left lateralized network involving Broca's area that I showed you at the start of the talk. You also have that curls round into the anterior insula, and there's also some areas right at the back of auditory cortex that are recruited when you speak, even if you just mouth. You're guiding articulation by using auditory information. So this is one way that humans produce those voices that we then decode with our brains, but it's not the only way that we produce voices. So other mammals and humans have an older evolutionarily older network, I should say, for the control of vocalizations, which runs down the midline. And this involves the anterior cingulate, which projects down to the periaqueductal gray and nuclei in the brainstem, and then that directly controls articulation. And that's for highly automatized vocalizations like screams or swearing. And it's interesting that patients who have aphasia and have damage to these lateral motor areas, they can still do things like cry and laugh and produce highly automatized speech, like I know or swear words, because they seem to be part of this evolutionary older network, a much more reactive network, a much more emotional network. Remember, most other mammals, when they vocalize, do so reactively. They are not doing so under sort of voluntary control. And sometimes when you listen to humans, a bit like that clip I played you at the start, you're actually hearing the two networks in direct competition. There's something very truthy about talking, because even if you're using all this lovely voluntary motor control to produce your speech, you still have possibilities for this completely involuntary network to influence what you're doing. So I've got another clip here from the Today Show. This is James Naughtie talking about Jeremy Hunt.
What's happening in the course of the next hour? Well, first up after the news, I'm going to be talking to Jeremy Hunt, the Culture Secretary, about broadband. It's 8 o'clock on Monday, The 6th of December. American officials have condemned WikiLeaks after the website published a list of hundreds of facilities said to be vital for American security. Every community in Britain has been promised that it'll have access to the fastest broadband networks within 5 years. Excuse me, and Egypt has called in international shark experts to investigate a series of attacks in the Red Sea. Pardon me, coughing fit.
Now, the more keen-eyed amongst you will have noticed that was not a coughing fit. That was James Naughty mispronouncing Jeremy Hunt's name and then starting to laugh. And heroically, he manages to keep talking, but you can absolutely hear the effect on his voice. There is no missing what's happening there. There is something greatly disrupting the production of fluent speech, and that's effectively him trying not to laugh. If you'd let that go, then the laughter simply would have overtaken it. We don't understand why, but there does seem to be a mechanism for these involuntary networks frequently to completely overwhelm the voluntary network. Now, if we just go back to the slide I showed you at the start of running the MRI machine as a way of looking as like inside the articulators for the sheer complexity of the human voice. I was emphasizing how this is still a source filter thing. We've got this, we're making a sound down here and then we're shaping it. If we look at these emotional vocalizations, which can frequently be highly involuntary, they're produced in a similar way in terms of neural control as these as the vocalizations of other mammals. And in fact, if we look at them in detail, they are even produced in the same way. So if you look at the same woman who I showed you here talking, now I show you her laughing, you'll see all of that fine control goes away. So she's making a sound at the larynx, and then she's just opening her mouth. This is almost exactly the same as what the red deer was doing. So you can see the tongue is just sitting at the bottom of the mouth. None of that movement. And she's opening her mouth quite a lot. So this really is more like an animal call than it is like speech. And in fact, if we look in detail, you can actually see this build up. So if we look at breathing, which is key to how mammals are producing sound, it's all a way of controlling breath to make that sound come through the larynx. When breathing metabolic, you get this very smooth pattern of the air coming in and out of the lungs, just being squeezed in and out. So this is just using what's called a breath belt to measure the movements of the rib cage. So you're all using metabolic breathing right now. Don't stop. That's very important for staying alive. As soon as you start talking, we use those same muscles very differently. When we're talking, we take a breath of air and then we very finely control the flow of air, that source sound at the filter. And that's giving us things like the melody and the rhythm of our voice. And that's giving us sentences. We can speak over long periods of time because we are controlling how we breathe out. This is what happens when you're laughing. You breathe out, but now you get very, very fast deflections. And each one of those deflections is just air being squeezed out of you. So that's where most of the work for something like laughter is coming from. It's not happening up here at all. It's happening down at the rib cage. And you can even see this here. So this is a spectrogram that's showing us time in that direction and frequency in this direction. And where the color is darker, there is more energy. And what this is showing you is that basically when someone is talking, those very complex filter characteristics of the human voice give us this continuously changing pattern of sound, which is actually reflecting these different resonance characteristics of the filter at any one point in time. And you're actually seeing that as a very quickly changing pattern of energy over time in this spectrogram. If we compare that to laughter, a sound is being made on each of those individual ha, 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 just squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. So there is none of that fine control of the articulators, and thus no complexity being introduced in terms of how the resonance characteristics of the voice are changing over time. So basically laughter is being recognized primarily just almost at the waveform level for these big changes in amplitude for each of those big bursts. And in fact, I don't have an example of this to show you, but you can almost fill these bursts up with anything, as long as you've got that rhythm of the laughter. People hear laughter. Now, when I say laughter is more like an animal call than it is like speech, this is what I'm talking about. This is a bonobo laughing, and it doesn't sound exactly the same as a human laughter. They laugh on an exhalation and an inhalation. So a bit like Muttley, if anybody remembers wacky races, but kind of sound. Here we go. So it's not exactly the same as human laughter, but it's quite recognizably similar. Now, the reason why I started studying any of this, and I promise you I will come back to language, is because in addition to my work on sort of speech and sound that I was doing, started with my PhD at UCL and carried on doing throughout the 90s, again, with my late colleague Andy Calder, I got very interested in how we recognize emotion from the voice. And my colleague Andy Calder and Andy Young were working with patients who had deficits in recognition of certain emotions following brain damage. And what they wanted to know was, is this specific to faces, or could it actually be identified via some other route? Is it a face problem or is it an emotional problem? So to do this, what they did was they worked with what are called the Ekman faces, which are highly recognizable demonstrations of different, what Ekman calls basic emotions. So these are emotions that are arguably recognized by all human communities. They're not in any sense a wider description of everybody's emotional life, but in terms of emotion recognition, they are very well recognized. So you have things like happiness, sadness, anger going across from the bottom, fear, disgust, and sadness. A surprise, sorry. And they were using this because, of course, you're testing somebody after they've experienced this insult to their brain, which has left them with an altered perception. So to determine whether or not there is something different about their experience, you need to use something that you would expect most people to be able to recognize. So that's why they started with these faces. They weren't particularly, focused on them being basic emotions. It was just a way of testing for possible change. So for example, patients with amygdala damage tend to be bad at recognizing fearful faces and angry faces, but they're fine with the rest. So I was coming up with vocal versions of these, and I was just giving people scenarios and then getting them to produce sounds that would fit with those scenarios, and then using the sounds that worked for that, that people could recognize. So the same patient who would struggle to recognize a fearful face and an angry face would struggle to recognize a scream as sounding frightened, or an angry growl as sounding angry. And one of the things that just worried me, not worried is the wrong phrase, I was interested in this. There was very little work on these emotional vocalizations. Remember, these are all more like animal calls than they are like speech. And I had the chance to meet Paul Ekman at a conference actually at Chandler House back in the very early noughties. And I asked him why they were all so negative. I mean, if you look at it, there's only one emotion here, which is unambiguously positive. And it feels like on a day-to-day basis, I experience some negative emotions, but there seem to be like often more positive emotions. So why is this? And Paul Ekman thought, actually, it's because of how we're testing it. He was testing, all this work was done with photographs of faces. And these people aren't even posing emotional expressions. They are posing configurations of muscle groups. And he thought that if you went in with a different modality, if you look at voices or body movement, then actually there could be other emotions out there which would have these characteristics of being basic emotions, i.e. recognized in all human cultures, but they're not particularly well distinguished by a face, because a static face, that they might all incorporate an element of a smile and therefore not be well told apart. So you need something more dynamic. You need the body, you need the voice, you need a moving face. So he suggested emotions like triumph. So we've got Dame Kelly Holmes winning, not just winning a race, but realizing she's broken a record. What he called and what I called amusement for many years. And then the really expressions of relief, contentment, and pleasure. And he'd actually published a paper suggesting these, and I thought, well, great, I work on voices, let's start testing this. So I just widened out the set of emotional experiences or expressions that I was trying to collect examples of, and I'd carried on doing the same thing. So in addition to the negative emotions I was already working with, I would give people scenarios and then get examples of sounds that they produced to those scenarios, and then see which ones people could recognize. And interestingly, very quickly, contentment and pleasure drop right off. Those are not two different sounds. They both seem to be versions of a pleasurable emotional expression. But of course, it's very, very difficult if you are working at all in the world of emotions and you want to determine whether or not what you're looking at has got anything to do with like a truly basic emotion, i.e. something that is cross-culturally recognized in all human communities. Because if you only work in your little group of participants in London or the UK or North Europe, then it's very, very hard to say that you've got something that is meaningfully being, connecting different human groups, because they're all sharing massive amounts of their cultural environment, which means that things could be just purely culturally determined. You can't tell the difference. So my PhD student, Decisionmaking, did several trips out to Namibia to my postdoc, Frank Eisner, where we were specifically asking this question. If we go to a completely uncontaminated group of people, they're not, she was working with the Himba in northern Namibia, so they are not, at this time, certainly, the people she was working with had not met people from Europe before. In fact, very, very few of the Himba community she'd worked with had met anybody outside of their community, because they live in very isolated parts of northern Namibia. A couple of times a year, a couple of the men would be working with different, encounter different Angolan cattle dealers for trade, and that would be it. So they're very good for our purposes, and they're not contaminated by our culture. If they recognize our emotional expressions from our voices and vice versa, it suggests that we do have something that really is, again, showing a possibility for being cross-culturally and meaningfully considered to be a basic emotion. And it's also important to notice this is the first time anybody had done this with voices. All the work had been done with faces. We also got the Himba to produce emotional expressions. See if you can recognize what this one is. So absolutely no points whatsoever for recognizing that at the end there he started laughing. You can actually hear other people are laughing with him. The sound he produced before then was triumph. Now that's interesting, because he knows what it means to express a triumphant feeling, to feel triumphant, to feel like you've won something. But he doesn't recognize British people making a woo sound, and we don't really hear that as sounding triumphant. So what you've got there, the triumph part, was not a basic emotion. The laughter, however, looks like it might well be. So if we just look at our data, now we're looking at the English recognizing the Himba recognizing the English. We replicate Paul Ekman's work with faces, with the voice. So anger, disgust, fear, sadness, and surprise are cross-culturally recognized in both directions. The only positive emotion that is showing the same pattern very clearly is laughter. There is something funny happening with relief, and I'm happy to take questions on that. But it certainly looks like laughter might well be something we could start to be considering to be a basic expression of emotion. And we should actually have thought more seriously, because at this stage, laughter wasn't something I was studying on its own. Laughter was actually a very good candidate for being a basic expression of emotion, because we aren't the only animals that laugh. If laughter is one of these emotions that has an older evolutionary history, you won't expect to find some example of it out there. However, not that there are very many studies looking at this, but how would you determine if another animal was laughing? Well, it's generally done by situational context. So one of the primary sources of laughter for human babies, by no means the only ones, happy to take questions on that, but a big one is tickling. Interestingly, tickling is intensely social. You can't just march up and tickle any baby. You have to have a relationship with that baby. The baby has to be old enough. It sort of kicks in at around 3 months old. And it's a social interaction, because you can't tickle yourself. There has to be someone else doing the tickling. And that's actually true for other things that makes human infants laugh. Things like peekaboo, that doesn't work if it's just eyes opening and closing on the TV screen. There has to be another human there showing their intention is to do this playful thing with you. So in fact, right from the outset, laughter is pretty complex thing for babies to be doing. But in the context of tickling, it's a good place to start, because tickling also works in other animals. So tickling is associated with laughter for other apes and even for rats. So where the handful of studies that have done looking at this find that there's a very strong role for tickling, which is maybe a kind of playful, effective touch, in eliciting laughter vocalizations. As we get older, where laughter has been described, given that there are not very many studies looking at this, laughter is strongly associated with play. So all mammals play when they are infants and juveniles, and some mammals play their whole lives. How you show that your intentions are playful, that you are doing play rather than being sexual or being aggressive, is indicated, and it's important that you distinguish this, is indicated by things like play face, so this loose, open, very unthreatening mouth. You get things, the dogs are doing it there, actually, something like Freudensprung, where you get these kind of very stiff legs jumping up and down. And this dog here is doing a play bow. What that means, and this is very important to dogs, after that bow, that means everything after this is a game. I might bite, might growl at you, but I'm not angry because this is a game. So it's actually, even again, in other mammals, it's an ambiguous behavior, and they are using signals to show that they are being playful. Interestingly, devocalized rats will still play with other rats, but they are much more likely to get bitten during play because they can't make the vocalizations that indicate that they are being playful, and it seems more likely that their behavior gets misinterpreted and they get bitten. Just to show you, it's hard to get photographs of play faces in adults. Here we've got some apes, much easier in children. But I need you to notice how much like a chimpanzee my brother looks there. And another interesting thing about laughter in humans, so it is definitely, we are not the only animals that laugh, but there are some distinct differences about laughter in humans. So laughter is contagious in humans. This was an early brain scanning study where, again, laughter started to look a bit different. We were just looking at the perception of emotional vocalizations, and what we found was a lot of orofacial mirror activation, which in fact we weren't expecting, much more than you ever get for people listening to speech. And that orofacial mirror response, that priming response, wasn't equivalent for all the emotional vocalizations. It was much more strongly driven by high valence, high arousal vocalizations, i.e. laughter, and also to some extent triumph. And actually the contagiousness of laughter is that, which is what we think we're seeing here. So we didn't set out to study contagion in laughter. That's not what we thought we were looking at, but it does look like you're getting a strong priming response when you hear laughter. And indeed, laughter is contagious for humans. It's not contagious for other apes. And it's something that we learn to do. So babies do not laugh contagiously. They learn to laugh. Arguably, we teach them to laugh contagiously, and it's still very social. So you're much more likely to catch a laugh from someone you know than someone you don't know. And it's extremely powerful. By the time you're an adult, a lot of the laughter you produce is in fact associated just with other people's laughter, and you tend not to realize it. Robert Provine found that people will argue away, or they'll give you a reason why they were laughing, even if it was purely contagious. I've got a very quick clip here, again from television broadcasting. This is a religious program where there are two men listening to religious songs that call in and sing to them. The man with the glasses, there's two different kinds of laughter happening here. The man with the glasses hears something that makes him laugh, and he starts to laugh in a highly involuntary way. His colleague starts to look really worried, because this is television and it's going to come across badly if his colleague is laughing at the people calling in. However, he also keeps laughing, and that is just contagion. You can't actually suppress that. He's trying to a bit, but he just keeps slipping into it. So watch the facial expressions of the man who isn't wearing glasses, and enjoy the other man's laughter, because it's good.
We're really trying to get out there in the record scene, but we're just gonna sing for you. I'm gonna sing for you right now.
Okay.
I cry in the midnight hour, yeah. You heard my cry. You bottled up all of my tears. That's why, I'm still loving you, oh Lord, yeah, yeah. Oh yeah.
That was good. That was excellent. I was excellent. You know, I certainly did enjoy that. He's caught up in the spirit. He's getting the Holy Ghost over here. We want to. He has the spirit. He's still loving you. We want to get his address. Get his address, and we want to give you a T-shirt here. Oh! Send him a T-shirt. Right here. Right. More consciousness. Enjoy that, Danny, from Florida.
Oh, I know, be the same.
So two really beautiful examples of laughter there. One, something has triggered. We can see he's actually crying with laughter. And his colleague, really quite worried, trying to keep things together, also continuously smiling and laughing. And that is just contagion. And again, probably they didn't know each other or they didn't like each other. It's a lot less likely that contagion would have happened. So you're much more likely to catch these things from people you know than people you don't know. And actually, this takes us to adult humans and laughter. So adult humans and laughter is very interesting. If you ask people about what makes them laugh, they'll talk about jokes and humor, and we do laugh at jokes and humor. But in fact, most of the time when we laugh, it's got nothing to do with jokes or humor. And that's because laughter, as Peter said at the top, is primarily a social behavior. We laugh when we're with other people. And that's very, very striking. I mean, the figure 30 times more likely to laugh when you're with somebody else than when you're on your own sounds extreme, but it really is on that order, if not higher, actually. And what this means is actually we laugh most when we're in conversation, because conversation is how humans manage face-to-face interactions. Whether you are speaking or you are signing, conversation is how we interact with other people, and that's where laughter lives, in the middle of this amazing kind of vocal or signed communication, which only humans seem to be able to do. We have this old mammal play vocalization going on a great deal. It happens a lot. Everybody laughs more than they think they do. For what few studies there are, find that everybody underestimates how frequently they laugh. And even in quite boring conversations where people are, say, taking part in a psychology experiment, people laugh about 7 times for every 10 minutes of conversation, which is a lot. We've found that friends, when they're laughing together in a conversation, laugh on average for 10% of the whole conversation is just the 2 friends laughing. That's an average. Some people laugh more. It's all modulated socially. So the more you know people, the more you like people, the more you will laugh. And what this means in practice is that human laughter can be happening because other people are laughing. We're just doing it contagiously. We will laugh to make and maintain social bonds. It's a very effective way of doing that. We'll laugh to show that we agree, we understand, we remember what other people are saying. That's a lot of what it's doing in conversations. And in fact, Robert Provine found that at any one point in time, the person who laughs most is the person who is talking. They are laughing to get the people they're talking to show that they agree, they understand, they remember, they recognize. We will also laugh to reframe things as play, to remember its role as this kind of play vocalization. And that's got a lot of the use of laughter to diffuse tension or stress actually has its roots, I think, in this playful use of laughter. So laughter is very interesting. And I have ducked the question, you'll notice here, of what the actual emotional expression it is. What are we expressing when we laugh? I called it amusement for many years, but it can't just be that, because actually most of the time laughter has nothing to do with amusement. Darwin wrote a lot about laughter, and he thought it was a sign of joy. And I suspect that probably the best way to think about laughter is as a social joy, because it's not something that we do very much when we're on our own. It's something we do when we're with other people. It is primed by the presence of other people. This is just a very quick clip showing you 2 people coming in to take part in an experiment. And this is just to show you the frequency with which people drop into laughter. So these 2 people know that they're being recorded. They're taking part in a study of friendship, which in fact we are looking at how much they laugh. They're both smiling quite a lot, but what happens as soon as the experimenter goes out of the room, they turn and look to each other and they just immediately start laughing. She's gone now. It's just you and me. We can start being ourselves. And the way they show this is by laughing together. So she hasn't gone yet. They're going to watch. We really are just waiting for her to go now. And she's off.
I'm not sure I understand.
And now, as soon as she's gone, laughter, and it ramps up completely as soon as it's just the 2 of them. So this makes laughter a very interesting behavior to study. I'm aware of the time. I will finish very shortly. Sorry. Oh, perhaps even more shortly, because I can't get my slides to move on. Right. One of the things we got interested in is the extent to which there might be different kinds of laughter. Maybe fake laughter or posed laughter, in the same way that we have posed or real smiles. So this is Paul Ekman smiling. One of these smiles looks nicer. People generally think the one on the right looks nicer, and that's because on the right he's smiling with his eyes. In fact, the one on the left is a composite image where the eyes have been brought in from a neutral face, and it makes the smile look colder. And in fact, when people smile to command, it tends to look more, in a voluntary way, it looks more like that laugh on the left. Sorry, the smile on the left. So we wanted to know, is there something like that with laughter? So we just did whatever it took to get people to laugh, and then we got those same people to laugh in a more conversational way. Sounds like this. So that's actually a spontaneous laugh. and that is a more conversational laugh. They're different acoustically. The real laughs are higher in pitch, they're longer, but that more conversational laugh was very nasal, and actually that's something quite consistently that we have found in more sort of posed conversational laughter. They got a kind of ha 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 quality. People are actually showing, I think, because most of the laughter you encounter is more like that second one. People, and it's generally positively meant. I think people are actually marking it. I'm giving you this laughter. We found that even if people don't know what's going on, your brain classifies the two different kinds of laughter differently. You get activation in the mentalizing network to the more conversational laughter, and in acoustic areas shown in blue for that more spontaneous laughter, possibly because you hear very unambiguous sounds. Whereas when you hear somebody laughing intentionally, you're trying to work out why, and that's recruiting the mentalizing network. That priming response I showed you before, we actually got for all the laughter. It didn't distinguish between the two different kinds of laughter, but where it did make a difference was across people. The more people, the better people were at classifying the two different kinds of laughter after the scan, correlated with how much they'd recruited this orofacial priming response earlier when they were listening to any laughter. So it's not just contagion. If you are primed to join in when you listen to laughter, you actually seem to understand what it means better. There's a very interesting developmental trajectory to this we're still trying to work out. But basically, we don't, children, if you ask children between the ages of 3 and 8, what kind of laughter is that? They hear laughter, they don't know what you're talking about. And this is a very big data set we collected at the Science Museum. What you find is that people's ability to recognize that spontaneous laughter starts to get pretty good by the time you're in your teens. But actually that more socially kind of communicative laughter, that conversational laughter, has a much slower trajectory. And people are only really getting good at that by the time they're in their 30s, suggesting it's something you learn about in your early adult life, which of course means that's something that could go wrong. Things might affect this. And indeed, we have found this. So we did a study with Eamon McCrory and S.E. Bidding with the boys that they're working with who are at risk of psychopathy. So these are teenage boys high in callous and unemotional traits who have conduct disorders. And they not only find laughter less contagious, this is a behavioral study here, just rating how contagious laughter is. They actually show a significantly reduced priming response in the brain when they listen to laughter. So we don't know what the direction of causality is here, because we don't know if you're seeing this because of the experiences the boys have had, which have also put them at risk of psychopathy, or if some characteristics associated with this risk have actually meant this is not something they've been able to learn. But if you think of the implications of this, if you can't use laughter for all these complex ways and interactions, and you can't use laughter to deal with stress, and you can't use laughter to make and maintain social bonds, what does that mean for the interactions that you have? What does that mean for the experiences you have with those interactions? And this is why I think laughter matters. It's been described as the shortest distance between two people, but actually the same is true for talking. If you think about laughter as something that's sitting in conversations, well, you don't just have conversations randomly either. You don't talk very much when you're on your own. You're probably 30 times more likely to speak when there's other people there than when you're on your own. So what actually you are seeing isn't that we've got a conversation and then we drop some laughter in. What we're actually seeing, and I think it really helps to think about speech in the same way as laughter for this, is actually this kind of communication is something that isn't something that happens randomly. The opportunities for laughter, for example, are not something that you just do throughout the entire day. You will only laugh with certain people at certain times in certain places. And that will also be true for how you're talking to them. And the reason why I've been thinking more and more about this is because we know, for example, and I'm sure everybody in this call knows much better than me, that the strength and the nature of your social network has incredibly strong impact on your mental health and your physical well-being. And this is just from a recent paper by Robin Dunbar exploring factors that interact with that. So you've got your social network, you've got your clique, you've got other things in the world that are affecting this, your community engagement, the opportunity to eat and be with those people who are in your social network. But the really important part is that, of course, when you're with your social network, those are the people that you talk to. Those are the people and the places where the laughter will live. So I think actually, if we could get a much better understanding of the social meaning of laughter and the sorts of conversations where laughter happens, it's really going to be something that can tell us a lot about the kinds of relationships that the people in that interaction are having, and also the things that might be affecting that. So, for example, we know nothing about how these things actually develop in children and what could be affecting that. And that's something that I think really could be, let us map from this complicated, strange human voice into the sorts of social and emotional interactions that really are having strong interactions with our mental health and our well-being. Thank you very much. I said I wouldn't overrun and I did, sorry.
But it's wonderful that you did. It's really a fascinating talk, and I didn't even realize that time was passing, and it never occurred to me to stop you. So they've got piles of questions, so I don't know quite how we'll, and they range across many areas that you touched on. So I'm going to go through it kind of chronologically, which will take us out of the laughter sphere into the first half of your talk, the first third of your talk. You talked about the similarity of music and speech. Do you have anything to say about the melody of the voice and the impact of music on emotions, and how is the sound of speech received differently from music?
I find it very interesting in the study of sort of the psychology and neuroscience of music that we never think of the voice as a musical instrument, whereas it is the first musical instrument. It's the one that everybody has one way or the other, and it's actually because you can hear for the last 3 months in utero. You learn a lot from your mother's voice, and you can't hear the words she's saying because it's heavily filtered, but what you can hear is the rhythm of her voice and the melody of her voice, and that doesn't seem to be useless information. So babies are born not just able to recognize their mother's voice, but they're also born knowing something about the rhythmic characteristics and the melody of the language that she speaks, the languages that she speaks, and that actually helps babies pull words out from what they hear. It's like the music is giving you a scaffold for that. And it also, I think, gives you a link to like a source of comfort. It's very striking that all mothers sing to their newborn infants. Not much calms down newborn babies or very young babies, but being fed, being held, being sung to in that kind of crooning way, it's an absolute universal use of the voice. So I think there's something very basic about the voice and music, and it might be, we tend to sort of, because music is so much more than that, it's a whole world of sound. But I think it has its roots, I suspect it has its roots in voices, and that might be one of the really kind of, because of how early it was, a source of comfort and social and sort of emotional closeness in your life. There is something very primal to that. It kind of gets around a lot of things, I think.
A question that I think probably a number of people are interested in. Sophie, you made perhaps clear for the first time for many people how language is processed and how the different ways in which aspects of language, vocal identity, emotion, as well as semantics are combined and integrated in the brain. Do we know anything about neurodivergent people, how this complex relationship may be different for the individuals who are neurodivergent?
It's difficult because I think it's often been approached, let me rephrase that. The way that I have told this story, and particularly around the speech aspect of it and the different elements of the voice information, those are all studies where you exaggerate difference. So you see a solo thing, here is speech perception, here is melody perception. And of course, in reality, it's not that cleanly dissociated. There was a strong approach towards looking at some of these brain areas I was talking about, which are actually the superior temporal sulcus. People got very interested in looking at how that was different in its processing in people with autism. And I never very convinced by that because the technique is almost set up to find a difference. I don't know how meaningful that is. I'm not saying there couldn't be something very useful discovered in that way, but for example, I think it is also important to think about how you ask the question. So with the laughter, people often ask about people with autism and laughter. And it is the case, my PhD student, Sophie Scott, has been looking at this. If you use how real does this laughter sound? How authentic does this laughter sound? How contagious does this laughter sound? Which is what we normally do. If we do that with people with autism, we do find a different profile from the neurotypical groups. But Ceci was very worried that that was not the right way of asking the question. There was actually nothing to do with the laughter. It was to do with these odd questions. So Ceci had the very good idea of asking people how funny jokes were, jokes that were read aloud, and then putting laughter onto the end of jokes and then getting people to rate, different people to rate them. And what you find is if you add laughter onto the end of jokes, people rate the joke as funnier. They're thinking about how funny the joke is, but you can't sort of ignore the laughter. And the more spontaneous the laughter, the funnier it makes the joke. And that was exactly the same for adult people with autism as it was for the neurotypical group. There was no difference whatsoever. In fact, the only difference was the people with autism tended to be more generous about how funny the jokes were. They were equally sort of affected by the laughter. So I suspect that sometimes with the issues around neurodivergence, it's how we ask the question strongly influences what we're seeing. And I think sometimes the way we ask the question isn't necessarily quite right.
That's really interesting. That and would in callous and emotional children, would that at the end of the laughter, at the end of the joke, would that have less of an impact, you would guess?
At this stage, we just don't know. It would be very interesting to know. It would be very interesting to know.
Well, another study for another PhD, perhaps.
Definitely, definitely.
Moving rapidly on, though. In films, sometimes characters, spies, or whoever, are shown as being trained not to make screams, not to respond, to suppress their emotions. You showed us a wonderful clip of somebody trying to suppress laughter and not being able to do so. And we won't repeat any of the words that were being said in there. To what extent do the kind of more mature parts of the brain have control over this more archaic part that it makes us laugh or has us laughing?
It's very interesting. If you look at actors before they go on stage, they frequently, because it's bad form to get the giggles on stage, audiences don't dislike it, but the actors don't think it's not a good thing to do. It spoils things. So they, in my very limited experience, seem to they deal with the possibility of laughter coming in there, because if it does get in, it will make its way through and you won't be able to stop it by just keeping everything away from them. They don't muck about backstage. They're not being silly before they come out. There's no possibility for the laughter to kind of sort of swarm through and get into that space. And I think that's probably a better strategy than what people tend to do, which is if they start laughing, then think, oh, I must stop laughing. Because laughter just primes laughter. And if you think I mustn't laugh, you're still thinking about laughter. And it's a very, and particularly if it's kind of coming via that contagious route where you're often, although you're only hearing one person talking, there are two people in the studio on the radio examples. So it is something that's not happening in isolation, and it's just being bounced back and forth. So that kind of makes it worse. So there's the only real way to get is just to stop any way that it could get in there in the first place, because if it does get in, James Naughty, actually I used that clip because it's the only example I can find of someone who actually manages to keep talking. You could hear Charlotte Green by the end had completely lost control of her voice.
Yeah. It's a level of professionalism just to make that slip and then it all comes through. Okay. A slightly different toned question. If you are someone who's feeling low, who's depressed, what kind of impact would it have on your capacity to laugh or your response to laughter? How do you engage? Do you resonate less? And do you produce, what would happen?
We have had a go at looking at this. I don't have proper data to show you, but anecdotally, people with depression often find, particularly that kind of more communicative laughter, the not spontaneous laughter, the very common laughter, they find that actively aversive, and they're actively irritated by it. And I think that's because if you remove the recognition that somebody is using this laughter intentionally to try and engage with you, if you don't see that part of it, then it just seems fake and silly. And why are you doing it? Make it stop. And it's not working on me. Now that's just anecdotally, but this, we certainly, I mean, I think one of the reasons why I would be really keen to pick this study up again and try and get it published is because if you think of the knock-on effects, because laughter isn't something that is just being emitted by people at other people, it's something people do together and they kind of negotiate together effectively. And if one person isn't doing that, it won't just be impacting them, it will impact the entire interaction and everybody's element, everybody, the people are contributing to it. And that, I suspect, means that one of the main ways that humans, you know, can sort of make social contact, regulate emotions, get a little bit of an endorphin bump from a bit of social grooming, that has been removed from them because it's not working. And it's also been removed from the people with whom that would have been something that was once possible. So it doesn't, I think actually getting a handle on how laughter would change as people move through different elements of depression, I think probably would give you something, would tell you something quite interesting about not just the depression, but all the interactions that they're having.
Yeah, maybe we can come back to that. It's a really interesting point that actually clinically seems to be quite relevant. But let me ask another question, which has come up in a number of contexts. People with sensory loss, sight, sound, how does the kind of rather complex and elaborate set of mechanisms that assume quite a bit, how does all that impact on an individual's capacity to enjoy this vital social, vital social, you know, that 10% of any conversation is about laughter. Yeah. What if you have some sensory loss that actually impairs being able to join in on it?
It's something that I've talked to people in decal about looking at. It's certainly.
You have to explain to people what decal is.
So decal is the UCL's Center for Deafness, Cognition and Language, and they work primarily with people who are deaf signers, and so that's and it is actually very interesting. If you look at deaf signing conversations, people laugh in exactly the same way as they do in spoken conversations. They coordinate the laughter at the ends of sentences, although in theory you could laugh all the way through because you're not, in a very simple way, speaking, but actually you don't. So there's although many surface differences between spoken conversations and signed conversations, one thing that's really, really similar is the use of laughter. But those are both situations where people are having face-to-face interactions and you've got a lot of information, even if one channel is reduced, so hearing in that example. If you look at the more information you take away, and this is not data from people with sensory loss, this is just data from people having different kinds of interactions. So if people can see and hear each other on a screen or in the room, they laugh more than if they are on the phone when you've only got the voice, and they laugh more than the phone is better than text. And there's certainly, and if anybody, forgive me if I've got this wrong, but there's an Australian signed language for people who are blind and deaf, where you write on the hands. And to tell a joke, so it's a very intimate way of having a conversation. You're holding each other's hands and writing on each other's hands. But to tell a joke, you have to say at the start, this is funny, because there's nothing else that you can do to show that this is meant to be funny. And people appreciate that it is meant to be funny, but it tends not to lead to laughter, which is a source of great sadness for that community. So it's the exact same problem as text. It's very, very hard to get text to read as funny, particularly if someone doesn't want to hear it as funny. And so there's a real, there are big implications The only other thing I'd say that was quite interesting was I did a bit of work with people who were doing audio descriptions for blind audience members at the National Theatre, and they do an amazing job. If you go along and have this service, if you can go and watch a ballet show, and they will get you in advance and tell you what the different ballet terms or dance terms mean, so that you will know what is being described to you in this. It's amazing. But the problem they had was when they had the James Corden show, One Man, Two Governors, which is 70% physical comedy, because they would say he's fallen down the stairs, and they'd hit, the blind person would hit everybody else in the audience laughing in a way that he's just fallen down the stairs didn't connote. And it wasn't just not funny, it was highly alienating to not know why everybody else is laughing. And so, you know, it can impact in huge ways, and it's a great deal to do is how could you convey that information. So for example, with the audio descriptors, they'd never thought of trying to be funny. Why would they try and be funny? So we taught them how to do comedy, to try and help them find a way of, they could describe funnily something that's happening on the sound. Couldn't know how well it worked, but that's the sort of thing you need to start to think about. It's difficult. It is difficult.
Couple of slightly off the wall questions, but you should expect that. What about wanting to laugh in inappropriate context, like a funeral?
I think there's probably a couple of things going on there. I think one of the things about inappropriate laughter is that if it was appropriate, you wouldn't have noticed it. You know, you're noticing the kind of situational thing. Also, laughter is a very, very common way that people will, in interactions with other people, try and deal with stressful situations. And that, if no one else laughs, like if I kicked over a glass of wine when I was at a party and my hostess laughed it off, I'd know I was okay. If I laughed and no one else laughed, I would probably realize I was in dire trouble. I've made a really massive mistake here. So sometimes laughter can be inappropriate because it's no one's joining in with it, but it's got that kind of like desire to, you know, we're all okay here. We can sort of touch base on this. So I think that kind of comes back to the funeral example, because I think sometimes people are feeling stressed and looking for a reason to feel less stressed. And even if actually in that situation, laughter is probably not the one that is going to look best, it's a very overlearned habit.
Ken, is it possible for children to be laughing because they're hyper-aroused, but actually they're being traumatized in some way?
I don't know about children. It can definitely happen with adults. I think there's someone sent me an extraordinary story of they were working in the US at the weekend. They had to go into their place of work with their boss, no one else in the building, horrible sound outside, massive car accident, goes out with boss, they start dealing with it. At some point it becomes clear someone has been killed in the accident. It was awful. Whole rest of the day taken up with the sort of dealing with the outcome and sorting everything out. They go back into the work building, at which point her male boss became absolutely hysterical with laughter, absolutely mirthless, and totally sort of, you know, moving into something that is an abreaction, presumably associated with the horrible, stressful shock they'd had. So there is a point where it moves over into that for adults, not all adults, but it's definitely it's a kind of laughter that you see. I don't know about children. And one of the reasons why partly it's possible, I just don't know about it. But I think also children, there's like an honesty to children's laughter. When children laugh, they're never laughing because they're trying to get you to like them, or they're trying to pretend that they're not angry about something. There's none of this more extreme nuance that you get in adults. It's happening when a baby laughs. That's because the baby thinks this is brilliant, I'm having a great time. There's no side to it. So we learn to do that, and I wonder about if that's possibly where we, you know, that kind of opens up a route for it to be more affected by more extreme shock, or maybe just children's emotional reactions are different. So very long way of saying I don't know, Peter, sorry.
This we won't know either, but I can't stop asking. It has to be the last question because we're running out of time. But would you know if mask wearing during the pandemic impacted on any aspect of expression of humor or laughter or you know, it just,
yeah,
I mean, it's a major part of the face is covered.
yeah.
Signaling system is lost. What happened?
I'm not aware of any studies looking at it, but I would be very surprised if it didn't, because if you think about particularly laughter as being incredibly sensitive to the amount of information that you have as soon as you haven't got anything about the lower face. I mean, that clip I showed you of the two men doing the television program and the man with the glasses loses it. If you watch it again from the start, you'll notice he's really trying very hard to not laugh right from the beginning. And you can see his mouth trying to keep it together. Now, without that clue, you wouldn't, you know, so that there's all sorts of really subtle things going on there that even aren't, you know, we're leaking stuff all the time with the face. So half of that is not available. It has to be affecting it. I've certainly been very aware in like interactions in shops, it is harder to find a way of using, you know, the way that we normally use laughter, which is fairly kind of people will use laughter just in small interactions just to make things go more smoothly. And that's harder to do with a mask on because people might hear the laughter but not know why else you're producing it. And there's a greater risk of it being misinterpreted, I suspect.
Listen, this is a fantastic talk. Thank you so much, Sophie. You know, you have really demonstrated how the most serious scientific studies can actually answer questions that we all have about ourselves, about other people, and how understanding these reactions better, understanding what's going on, actually can make us operate in a social world that's so complex and that causes so many problems for so many children and young people and their families. Understanding it better can actually help us navigate through it, perhaps more smoothly, and how important communication of the science that lies behind that understanding is. And you have done such an incredible job in so many venues to make this accessible for a very broad range of people. So if that is an enormously important, in addition to your scientific contribution, just an enormously important and most wonderful thing that you have done. And we've been very privileged to benefit from it here tonight. And I want to thank you very much on behalf of all those who listened, but also myself. You know, it really is quite extraordinary. Thank you so much. And I really hope that I really hope that you out there enjoyed the evening as much as I have, and I hope that you will be able to join us again for our next seminar that will be given by Jelaine Cunari on September the 28th on race reflections. Do join us. The information is on our website, and we hope very much to see you again in September. Sophie, one final time, thank you so much for tonight, but thank you so much for all that you do.
Thank you, and thanks for the great questions. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks.